She arrived 10 minutes early, because that was how Clare Langley kept the world from surprising her by always being a little ahead of it. Snow had fallen soft and fast that afternoon, frosting the driveway of the Merritt house in a sugar-glass hush. Inside the foyer, garlands smelled faintly of pine and citrus, a low carol threading through the heated air. A coat brushed her wrists, a ribbon of steam rose from the cup she had abandoned at the kitchen island when Julian had told her to go upstairs and freshen up. She walked toward the living room with the composed gait of someone who had written budgets and balanced risk for half her career. Her hand found the brass of the doorknob like a ledger line. Two figures were already there: Julian, informal in a navy sweater, and a woman Clare had seen in glossy photos at charity galas, Mara Develin, laughing in a way that fit the room better than the season. The light shifted. Julian's voice, soft and easy, carried through the archway as if the house itself were leaning to listen. Then those words: "You are pregnant." They unthreaded the air. They were small, plain, and surgical. Clare felt the room change dimensions. For a fraction of a breath she did not notice the snow at her boots, the clink of a crystal flute, the way the garland glittered. The holiday music stretched and grew thin. It was not just the content of the sentence, 3 words, but the fact that they had formed in her husband's mouth towards someone who was not her. Everything inside her did not explode. It catalogued. Clare's mind, trained to sort data under pressure, ran a rapid inventory. The marriage, the prenuptial clauses she had negotiated years earlier, Julian's signature on corporate accounts, the patterns in expense reports she'd once reconciled for him. Her throat closed, but her pulse stayed even. An anomaly felt as cold metal in her palm. She counted to 3. 1. She stepped back into the shadow of the arch. 2. She set the paper cup down on the nearest console, as if the act could anchor her. 3. She turned and left the room without a word. Outside, the cold was honest and immediate. Steam from her breath hung like a ledger between her and the night. She breathed deliberately, tasting citrus and cold, and dialed Evan before she let a single interior syllable undo her. Evan picked up on the second ring. His voice was clipped, but not unkind. "Clare?" "I need containment," she said. The words were procedural, austere. "Listen to me, Evan, now." The first hours after discovery were a catalogue of triage. Clare's world, which had been a weave of $50 and $75 million deals, donor dinners, and quarterly forecasts, rearranged into files and holds. She called Daniela, her accountant, whose loyalty had always been measured in forensic ledgers and late-night calculations. Daniela told her to breathe and then told her, without breathlessness, what to do. Preserve everything. No transfers. I will flag movements. Make images. Screenshots, timestamps. Put any physical mail in a scanned folder. Don't delete anything. Don't send emails that sound like emotions. "Right," Clare said, surprised at how easy it felt to obey. She called Mark, an old board colleague who knew how to read the press. He would be the networker. He would keep the message steady in front of investors and trustees who might be fretting on Christmas Eve. Mark advised a single neutral public statement if asked. No admissions, no theatrics, a commitment to governance. By midnight, Clare had an emergency folder on an encrypted drive, a list of contacts in 4 cities, and a plan that required no righteousness but required rigor. She slept in a spare room on the Merritt estate, because leaving would have been an admission that she could not stay. And in the morning, she convened the people who were most useful in a crisis: Evan, Daniela, and Mark. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following morning under terms the company's bylaws allowed for urgent convening. Clare walked into the boardroom with documents that smelt faintly of printer toner and a calm she did not entirely own. The boardroom was a geometry of glass and dark walnut. City light cut across the table. Martin Chen and Rachel Ortiz were there by video. Omar Shah and Layla Park arrived with their own questions folded neatly into their expressions. Clare opened with fact, not accusation. She had always been a chief information officer for firms that valued clarity above moral outrage. There was a discipline to dispassion. She set exhibits on the screen, a ledger that showed discretionary distributions with odd routing, redacted emails indicating third-party accounts, time-stamped screenshots of transfers that didn't align with the company's charters. Where there were gaps, she acknowledged them. "This is governance," she said, "not vengeance. There are fiduciary questions we must address." She kept the parenthesis brief. Fiduciary meaning duties owed by officers and directors to act in the company's best interest. And we will use the instruments at our disposal to protect the institution. Evan outlined options in non-prescriptive language: an independent audit, an external review of financials, a temporary suspension of discretionary distributions to prevent asset movement, and the appointment of an oversight committee to examine conflicts of interest. He spoke in measured phrases, naming processes rather than promising outcomes. "We should be mindful of escalation and public perception," he said, "but the first job is containment." For 2 hours they sifted through numbers, asked narrow questions, and placed holds. A motion to appoint an independent auditor carried by a narrow vote. The motion to suspend discretionary distributions, money Julian could authorize without full board approval, passed by one single vote. Clare felt that margin like a bruise. Leadership is often decided by margins. After the meeting, she drafted a succinct email to the executive team and to compliance protocols. Transfers to certain accounts were on hold, and all signatory powers would be temporarily routed to a small committee. The email was sterile and exact. It did not mention Hurt. If anyone could have made it about spectacle, the press would have. Within 12 hours there were clips, news anchors with soft collars, pundit panels parsing the implications, and breathless headlines that treated a private betrayal like syndicated entertainment. Julian released a statement that read like damage control, a public commitment to privacy and family, a request for respect as he navigated personal matters. It was measured, appropriately sorrowful in tone, and instantly interpretable as the language of people who practiced spin. Clare watched the statement with an odd detachment, as if it were a reading of minutes from a prior meeting. Privately, Julian called her twice that evening. She let it ring. He sent a text that read, "Can we talk, please?" She didn't answer until morning, when Evan advised that silence was preferable to statements that could be construed as waiver or consent. The early days were a choreography of defensive work. Daniela flagged attempted wire transfers from accounts Julian controlled. One of them tried to clear to a small offshore vehicle in a jurisdiction designed to receive money with minimal questions. Daniela put a freeze on the move internally with the bank under a discretionary hold they could place while they verified authority. The bank's compliance line at nearly midnight told Daniela only what protocol allowed, that a hold could be placed when internal signatures didn't match established patterns, and that such holds were designed to allow for verification without tipping the other party to tactics. When the media began to smell narrative, Billionaire falls from grace, Clare's team did not supply it. They let governance do the talking, audits, holds, oversight. The language of process replaced outsize emotion. It would have been easy, spectacle is always the simpler currency, to embrace a different kind of victory. But Clare did not want revenge. She wanted containment and correction. She wanted to transform the fissure into something institutional, accountable, something that, by design, could right the wrong without becoming a melodrama that consumed the people involved. That distinction was important to her. It kept the work tethered to outcomes rather than to a headline. 3 weeks after the overheard words, the company's auditor began a preliminary review. The board ordered a forensic look, a deeper, narrower excavation of unusual transfers and possible conflicts. Forensic here meant a targeted examination aimed at isolating anomalies. It was not an indictment. Journalists were persistent, but the company's release reiterated a commitment to due process and to protecting stakeholder value. In the middle of this, a new threat arrived. Thomas Reed, a developer Clare had met at a symposium years ago, sent a message through Mark. He had been watching from the edges, someone who built with care and had a practice of converting underutilized properties into community assets. Thomas asked to meet, untrusively, not with the urgencies of tabloids, but with an offer. They met at a small cafe that smelled of espresso and sawdust. Thomas carried blueprints in a slim portfolio and an unshowy earnestness. He listened as Clare described the situation, not in the language of betrayal, but in the language of assets and duty. What if the problem became the seed, he asked. He spoke about transforming the summer house, one of Julian's properties with sentimental history but little public utility, into an incubator for women entrepreneurs. Not a vanity project, he emphasized, but a legally constituted nonprofit, with audited oversight, measurable milestones, and partnerships with community colleges and workforce programs. Clare had always believed that civic work should be built with the same rigor as financial structuring. She asked for specifics: governance, board composition, conflict of interest safeguards. Thomas produced a preliminary plan: an independent trust, an oversight committee including community representatives, annual third-party audits, scholarships, and stipends for apprenticeships. The language pleased and unsettled her in equal measures. It was careful, it was also ambitious. "You're proposing to take something that has been a private asset and turn it into an institution with public obligations," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied, "and with oversight. We can draft a governance structure that prevents recapture for private gain. The funding model relies on a combination of seed capital, program grants, and revenue from leased makerspace units. We can commission an independent audit firm to report annually and make metrics public." Clare listened, tallying risk and opportunity as she always did. There was a political edge to this. Reallocating a symbol of private wealth into a communal resource would change narratives, not merely about Julian, but about the company that carried his name into markets and municipalities. If they executed it with transparency, it would be hard to reduce the work to a petty act. If they failed to so structure it, it would look like grandstanding. When Clare returned to the office, the board's edges had become sharper. Some members feared distraction, others saw strategic upside. The argument for the incubator was not sentimental in their minds, but strategic. It could re-anchor the company's reputation into tangible public good, creating measurable outcomes that the market and their constituents could evaluate. At the same time, the business side continued to require legal knitting. Julian, increasingly isolated in his private maneuvers, grew more public in his efforts to control narrative. He engaged a PR firm whose work was cleanly antiseptic. Messages about personal matters and private family discussions intended to blunt scrutiny. On the financial front, he attempted to exercise discretionary power to reassign certain assets. Daniela's flagging made those moves visible, and the bank's compliance team did what compliance teams do under suspicious patterns. They elevated the transaction, performed additional KYC, Know Your Customer checks, and requested further verification. There were nights when Clare woke with the echo of Julian's words in her ear, and she could feel the city like an organism around her, ridiculous, vast, adept at making personal catastrophes into public gossip. But those nights were also where her resolve sharpened. She convened a small working group: Evan for legal nuance, Daniela for arithmetic fidelity, Mark for external messaging, and Thomas for a roadmap that would redirect private capital into structured public benefit. They mapped out a sequence: secure the summer house under a letter of intent, fund a trust with clearly delineated restrictions, hire an independent auditor to issue public reports annually, and structure apprenticeships with measurable placement goals in 6 to 18 months. The crux was governance. Clare insisted that the instrument be ironclad against recapture. Thomas proposed a 3-tier oversight model: an independent board of the trust, a community advisory panel, and an external compliance officer. The documents would include prohibition clauses. No single person could unilaterally recommit the asset to private use. Distributions would be tied to performance metrics. Any major changes required a supermajority vote with community sign-off. Evan cautioned against legal overreach and against promising outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed. He reminded Clare that instruments could be challenged, that litigation could be protracted, and that time would erode advantage. "We're not promising anything the law will give on faith," he said. "We're creating structures that, if they hold up, are defensible and transparent." Clare agreed. She wanted the structure more than the spectacle. She wanted a body of work that would outlast headlines and that would produce numbers. Apprentices placed, businesses launched, scholarships awarded, audited reports confirming fiscal integrity. She wanted the pain to resolve into public value. Meanwhile, outside the rooms where plans were being drawn, the press distilled the story into something simpler. Overnight, gossip columns rippled with fabrications and innuendo. Versions of private arguments transformed into epic failures. Mara's presence at holiday gatherings was framed as a narrative fulcrum. The public imagination had found easy choreography. Clare felt the prickling of unwanted stares at conferences, invitations rescinded with awkward politeness, and the small, quietly measured exclusion that follows the fall of a household name. But the network of friends who mattered, those who saw governance as the faster route to repair, remained. The company's independent auditor requested access to accounts that had been flagged. The firm ran a preliminary reconciliation and found discrepancies, not a criminal ledger, but patterns of self-dealing and misspecifications that required explanation. The audit flagged transfers routed through consulting vehicles with insufficient documentation and expense accounts with entries that lacked adequate descriptive support. None of this was definitive on its face, but together they formed a puzzle the board could not ignore. At one point, Julian asked for an emergency meeting with the board to clarify his position. Clare declined to join a room that could serve as theater. She let the company speak through its instruments. It was an excruciating restraint to withhold oneself from the stage, and yet it felt ethically correct. The business was larger than her grief. One evening, 2 weeks after Maria's voice had cut across the living room, Daniela called a small victory. "We put a freeze on the transfer to that account," she reported. "They tried to move it through 3 different names, shell routing. Compliance flagged it as unusual, and our bank's monitoring team placed a discretionary hold pending verification. It bought us time." "Time is what we need," Clare said. The relief that threaded the sentence was quiet, almost unnoticeable. It was a tactical reprieve, not a vindication. The work with Thomas advanced in parallel. They toured the summer house on a wind-shorn afternoon. Plaster underfoot, a great hearth with soot-streaked brick, windows that looked out over a slope where gas lamps would stutter at dusk. To an outsider, it looked like inheritance, curio of taste gone soft with use, but Clare saw the bones: high ceilings, a wing that could hold workshops, a carriage house that could be retrofitted into shared office space. She imagined benches and sewing machines and solar collectors on the roof. She imagined apprentices learning not only trades but governance, what it took to build something that lasted more than a news cycle. They proposed a funding model that would transfer title into a charitable trust with restrictions guaranteeing public use. The trust would receive initial seed funding, and a portion of Julian-controlled liquidity, if allowed by the company and compatible with the prenuptial agreements, would be redirected into the trust through a managed settlement process. Evan cautioned that transfers tied to marital disputes were legally fraught, and that any motion for relief would have to be careful not to run afoul of contractual rights. He suggested that the parties consider alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and transparent accounting structures rather than a scorched-earth litigation strategy that would drain value from the institution they were trying to protect. They drafted an initial letter of intent regarding the summer house and circulated it to potential nonprofit advisors and municipal liaisons. The project gathered endorsements: a community college for vocational programs, a local microfinance nonprofit for startup loans, and a social enterprise consultancy willing to help with metrics. They sketched the first-year outcomes: 20 apprentices placed, 5 micro-enterprises launched, and a public third-party audit within 12 months. At the same time, the board meeting that had been narrowly decided earlier began to show fissures. Some members worried that the incubator proposal was a public relations maneuver thinly disguised as strategic philanthropy. Others argued that it was an opportunity to anchor the company to verifiable social value. Clare made the case with numbers. Reputational capital is quantifiable, she said. Not as precisely as ledgers, perhaps, but it is part of our balance sheet in the minds of consumers and investors. We can build it back with evidence. A motion to proceed with a letter of intent to transfer the summer house to a trust for community use passed, again narrowly. The vote felt like confirmation of a path, but also like an invitation to contest. Meanwhile, Daniela's audits uncovered more anomalies in deferred payments, and Evan filed motions to preserve assets pending a deeper hearing. He was careful in his description. He called it a motion for temporary relief, phrasing that signaled both urgency and legal restraint. The process would move slowly. Legal wheels are not made for the rapid rhythm of headlines. One evening, Julian came to the company compound under the thin veil of wanting to clarify intentions. He carried a stack of documents and a face arranged in public contrition. He could be plausible when he wanted to be, good at performance, and the boardroom paid attention. He spoke about legacy and privacy and his rights. He suggested alternative structures that, on the surface, could have been read as reasonable. Behind the saying, Clare recognized the old impulse to reassert control. In the hallway after the meeting, Clare confronted him, not with the rawness of betrayal, but with the exactness of numbers. "I don't need you to explain yourself to me, Julian," she said. "I need you to respect the structures we put in place. This is not about you as a man. It's about your obligations as a controller and as a signatory." He deflected. "You should let the lawyers handle this," he said, the old default of a man who had always expected professionals to do the dirty work of feeling. "Lawyers are already handling it," Clare replied, "and so am I." That night, when the winter wind rattled the eaves, Clare sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the redactions again. Names replaced by black bars, amounts followed by question marks. She found, tucked between pages, a handwritten note, Julian's handwriting, about a charitable fund. It was almost an apology in ink, if apology could be counted that way. For an instant she allowed herself to imagine a simpler conclusion, that a direct conversion could occur, a tidy reallocation to a trust, and an end to headlines. But Evan's voice in her ear reminded her of reality. Structures can be negotiated, obstructed, litigated, and delayed. In the weeks that followed, the pressure mounted into a slow boil. Julian's counsel threatened motions to contest aspects of the board's authority. The company filed to limit unilateral transfers pending a hearing. International reporters sought interviews and were rebuffed. Op-eds weighed in on the gender politics of betrayal and the implied hypocrisy of wealth. Mara, for her part, did not engage with reporters and kept a low social profile. Clare had no desire to amplify her into a villain. Mara was a person caught in a messy human calculus, and Clare's work was not about vengeance. At the root, Clare kept returning to governance. She believed that if institutions were robust enough to capture individual excesses and channel them into accountability, then pain could be converted into protection for others. That belief was neither naive nor grandiose. It was a practical optimism born from decades of building systems that anticipated failure and stopped it before collapse. The next tactical move was a hearing, where the board sought preliminary relief to maintain the status quo while the audit proceeded. It was a hearing the company requested on an expedited schedule, fast track, Evan described it, careful not to conflate speed with certainty. The hearing would not decide ultimate rights, but could preserve assets while parties litigated. It was the sort of legal scaffolding Clare both respected and feared, useful but impermanent. On the morning of the hearing, before she walked into the sterile courtroom where the panel would sit, Clare stood in the old kitchen on the Merritt estate where she had first learned to measure patience. The kettle sang faintly. Snow tracked light into the room. She thought of girls who would learn trades in the incubator one day. Maria, who had once been a resident in a neighboring block and wanted to teach culinary arts. Samira, who desired to start a tech repair collective. Tasha, who wanted to open a tailoring studio. Their names, vision placeholders for tangible futures, kept her steady in a way that headlines could not. She stepped into the hearing with the quiet clarity of someone who had rehearsed processes until they felt like muscle memory. She did not seek spectacle, she sought procedure. The motion she filed was procedural: preserve assets pending audit, authorize oversight. The hearing's outcome would be preliminary. It would buy the company time to continue its nonprofit planning and to let the audit speak. When the judge, an undistinguished administrative magistrate with a ledger of crowded calendars, heard the arguments, the decision was practical rather than poetic. The court granted temporary measures allowing the board to maintain holds while the audit proceeded. It was not a definitive victory, but it gave Clare the breathing room she needed. Evan explained carefully afterward that temporary relief did not equate to final resolution, but it did mean that the incubator plan could continue to develop without immediate asset flight. Outside the courthouse, the press clustered like cold birds. Julian provided a short statement about his intent to cooperate with the process and to ensure fairness. Clare declined to comment beyond a written statement affirming the company's commitment to transparency and community responsibility. It felt, against her personal grief, right to let the work be the narrative. And then, as the next layer of the plot began to tighten, something unexpected happened. A young reporter reached out not with a demand for scandal, but with a question about the incubator's model: how the trust would measure success, who would oversee it, how the community would be represented. Clare answered, carefully bridging what she could disclose and what the process required remained private. The resulting article, lean and factual, emphasized the project's potential for measurable social impact. It became a small corrective in the story airborne about betrayal and celebrity. Even as press cycles turned, the internal work accelerated. The architecture of the incubator was drafted in greater detail. Thomas worked with architects to convert workshop spaces into flexible areas. They identified program partners for apprenticeships and mentors. Evan began to draft the terms of the trust: restrictions that prevented single-party recapture, audit clauses binding to the trust's board, and a performance dashboard to be posted publicly each year. It was in one of these drafting sessions that Daniela found a new irregularity: a line item in a vendor ledger that had been coded as consulting but was connected to a private event planning company with ties to Mara's network. There was no immediate smoking gun, but it added to the mosaic. Clare instructed Daniela to deepen the line search, not because she sought to humiliate anyone, but because she believed accuracy in accounts was a moral act. As winter thinned into an uncertain spring, the summer house stood like an uncut diamond in the periphery of Clare's plans, something of beauty that required shaping. The first letter of intent arrived and was signed by a small committee with the authority delegated by the board. They included community representation. Maria's name appeared in a consultative capacity, a signal that the work intended to be for and with the neighborhood, not merely for headlines. Thomas and Clare walked the property with a surveyor and a notebook, sketching a future that was practical and repairable. Yet unresolved tensions pulsed beneath procedural calm. Julian's legal counsel filed counterpleadings that would slow any transaction dependent on marital settlement. There were private conversations, tense, juridical, often polite, that navigated personal rights against corporate obligations. Clare found those calls more wearing than any public headline. In them, she could feel the rawness of what began as a private wound but now wore corporate suits. On a late afternoon, when the light through the summer house windows slanted gold, Clare received a note from Evan. There were more irregularities flagged in a subsidiary contract that predated the current episode. The note was a technical thing: numbers in cells, annotations, a request for a focused tracing.
Clare read it twice, then 3 times. She folded the paper and walked out to the carriage house where Thomas had proposed to situate the makerspace. She stood in the dust and imagined benches. The smell of sawdust rose like a promise. It occurred to her, in a quiet, almost private way, that Heartbreak Unveiled could be an engine. Not because it was an instrument of revenge, but because visibility demanded responsibility. She felt the fatigue of weeks of hearings, a ledger of indignities, the slow chipping away at a private life. But she also felt the organizing joy of a project that could outlast both headlines and private errors. At sunset, Clare made a decision not out of triumph, but out of alignment with things she valued. She signed the letter of intent to form the trust upon conditions Thomas and Evan and Daniela had iteratively shaped. The document was meticulous. Oversight clauses, reporting requirements, restricted covenants, community representation. It was governance worn like armor, not to protect her feelings, but to protect a future for others. As the signature dried on the page and ink settled into a line that could be traced, a notification pinged on Daniela's phone. Another transfer had been attempted, this one smaller, one that could have vanished into the noise of reconciliations if not for the trail Daniela pursued. She reported it immediately. The hold was tightened. The company would bring it to the attention of the forensic auditors. Clare read the notice with a kind of steady acceptance. These would be the rhythms for the months to follow: hearings and audits, community meetings and scaffolding. There would be setbacks and moments when legal process would test patience. There would be days when the headlines returned to scream for tragedy. But there would also be apprentices in a carpentry room, a little cohort of women learning to weld and code and open shops. That image steadied her like an anchor. That night, the house silent except for the whisper of the heating, Clare walked alone to the carriage house and opened the door onto the slope. The winter garden was a dark promise of green. She imagined lanterns lining the path for the opening day, a congregation of learners crossing thresholds that once stood as private thresholds. She breathed in and felt, for a long, suspended moment, the strange confluence of grief and purpose. The story, her heartbreak unveiled on Christmas, had been caught up in the heat of gossip and legal maneuver. But in the slow work of drafting trust documents, in the tensile patience of auditors combing ledgers, and in the scaffolding of community partnerships, she found a labor that would turn private rupture into public accountability. It was not a closure so much as a direction, towards places where pain could be transmuted into systems that prevented similar wrongs for others. As Clare locked the carriage house and walked back to the estate through the freshly raked snow, her phone vibrated with one last message for the night. It was from Mark. "We have one more meeting set with the municipal liaison. They want to see the audit timeline before committing maintenance grants." Clare paused beneath a lamp that lit only her breath. She answered with the practicality that had become her companion. "Tell them we'll share timelines and metrics, transparency first." She sent the message and turned toward the house. She could hear music faintly, piped from a neighbor's holiday decorations that lingered even as the season waned. The sound threaded through the dark, familiar as grief and as possible as sunlight after snow. Inside, an email from a reporter asked for a comment on a leak, a purported list of beneficiaries that had surfaced online, incomplete and unvetted. Clare considered the impulse to react, to explain, to set the record straight. Instead, she instructed Daniela to verify the list and Evan to draft a careful response. No speculation, only confirmed information and an invitation to see the audited results when available. She stood at the window and looked out at the property she had chosen to reimagine. The summer house, with its history of private memories, would be the first public step in a much longer journey. There would be hearings to come, motions and counters, a legal choreography that could stretch longer than patience. There would likely be attempts to undermine the project's legitimacy, and others to appropriate it for narrative gain.
Clare felt the weariness behind her eyes and the resilience at the center of her chest. The overheard sentence, the 3 words that had cleaved her life, had not produced collapse. It had produced calculus. It had produced governance. Her phone buzzed again, and this time the text was from Thomas. Surveyor found unexpected encumbrance on the title. Small, but it requires counsel. Also, Maria called. She wants to bring a group of students to the site next month. Clare sat down at the table and placed her palms on the paper where the ink had dried. There were loose ends and legal threads to follow, and they would pull and sometimes tangle. But beneath the procedural lists and the careful motions lay a different kind of ledger, one of apprentices placed, audits cleared, tiny businesses launched. Those would be the numbers that mattered in the end. She made a list in her head, tasks for the next morning. Call Evan about the title encumbrance. Ask Daniela to deepen the trace on the vendor ledger. Respond to Mark about municipal timelines, and confirm the roster of community advisors. Then she added, privately and without a board's knowledge, a personal item: sleep for 4 unbroken hours. Outside, the wind picked up, sifting snow against the windows like a soft eraser. Inside, the house held its breath. Heartbreak had been unveiled on a night of pine and candlelight, but it had not finished its work. It had only, for now, announced itself. The real labor, the drafting of accountability, the building of structures that would protect others, was just beginning. The months that followed moved like a scaffold being raised around something fragile, deliberate, noisy in its own way, and engineered to bear weight. The headlines would still clamber for simple arcs: betrayal, scandal, redemption. But inside the rooms where documents were drafted and meetings were held, language was chosen for durability rather than drama. Clare lived in that vocabulary: covenants, restrictive clauses, escrow arrangements, third-party audits. Those words were her tools now, the instruments that would turn a private rupture into institutional safeguards. Before the settlement took shape, there were rounds of negotiation the way people pace in tight circles. Offers that masked intent, countermoves couched in civility, and the kind of bureaucratic patience that made frenzy look foolish. Julian's team proposed variations on transfer language that would reserve a residual right to retract under certain marital claims. Clare, with Evan at her side, proposed ironclad limitations: supermajority thresholds for any reversion, independent trusteeship, publicly disclosed performance metrics. The bargaining felt less like victory and more like laying a foundation, each clause a beam, each signature a bolt. Mara maintained distance. She did not court interviews, and when the occasional intruding camera found her in a public place, she answered with brevity and a request for privacy. Clare's reaction to Mara was never to gloat. If anything, she felt the oddness of human entanglement. People make mistakes, lives overlap, consequences extend beyond the individuals involved. Her energy was spent on structures, not shrieks. There were tactical skirmishes. A temporary injunction was discussed, language to prevent certain unilateral dispositions. Yet Evan was careful to describe these remedies as provisional, procedural tools to stabilize the status quo while the audit and negotiations proceeded. The board refused to be baited into spectacle. When Julian attempted a last-minute maneuver to fold an asset transfer into a merger clause, Daniela's tracing caught it. The bank's compliance team froze the instruction pending further verification. Those small interventions, holds, flags, verification calls, were the invisible stitches that prevented an abrupt unraveling. Then came the mediation session. A room with neutral light and a mediator tasked less with moralizing than with moving money into accountable channels. Parties were present: corporate counsel in navy suits, Julian's representatives calibrated to image, Clare's team fierce in their quiet. And the air felt like a ledger being balanced. Thomas attended not as a combatant, but as a witness to the proposed conversion. His presence signaled the project's seriousness. He brought a slide deck that showed community partners, projected outcomes, and the governance matrix that would govern the proposed trust. The settlement, when it took form, was not a single theatrical document, but a concatenation of instruments.
a settlement agreement, a deed of transfer conditional on trust formation, an oversight charter, and a funding schedule. The central piece was an irrevocable trust to which title of the summer house and seed funding would be transferred. The trust's charter prohibited reversion of use to private ownership without a supermajority vote, and required annual independent audits posted publicly. A community advisory panel would have advisory but not unilateral power to nominate trustees, and a compliance officer independent of either household would have standing to commission audits and report non-compliance to regulators and stakeholders. Those instruments reflected Clare's insistence on two principles: transparency and enforceability. Transparency meant regular public reporting, audited financial statements, a performance dashboard with metrics such as apprentices placed, businesses launched, scholarship disbursements, and occupancy rates for the makerspace. Enforceability meant legal locks, restrictive covenants on the property deed, irrevocable funding commitments placed into escrow, and contractual clauses that made recapture legally and financially onerous. Evan negotiated these clauses with an awareness of reality. They could be challenged, and they might be stretched in litigation, but framed carefully and funded transparently, they were defensible. He never promised perfect shelter. "This will reduce the opportunity for recapture," he said to the assembled parties, "but no instrument is immune to challenge. What we can do is create a public, audited trail that tilts the balance toward accountability." The settlement also included explicit funding commitments for operationalization, seed money to retrofit the summer house, an endowment sized to cover the first 3 years of programming, and a designated operations manager to be appointed by mutual agreement of the trust board and the community advisory panel. There was a dispute resolution clause requiring arbitration for any trust governance disagreements to keep the process faster and less prone to headline-driven litigation, and an agreed timeline for the selection of trustees and the commissioning of the first independent audit. Publicly, the announcement was measured. Clare drafted the company's press release with Mark's input. It emphasized the trust's mission and the governance mechanisms rather than personal narratives. A short statement from Julian accompanied it, disclaiming a desire for privacy and expressing support for the trust's stated goals. No one expected the press to be satisfied by nuance. Still, the release reframed the arc. What had been a private fracture had, by agreement, been harnessed into a public structure. The days leading to the official transfer were dense. Surveyors untangled title encumbrances. Senior counsel reviewed deeds for latent claims. Municipal liaisons confirmed zoning allowances for mixed-use programming. Funders reviewed budgets and underwriting assumptions. Thomas coordinated construction bids, favoring local contractors and insisting on living wage commitments where feasible. Clare pushed for apprenticeships embedded into contracts, a clause guaranteeing that a percentage of labor hours be devoted to trainees as part of the retrofit. It was an operationalization of the project's moral premise, that the asset should not only provide space but be a generator of skills and livelihoods. On opening day, the winter garden had transformed. Where soot once streaked the hearth, a clean line of benches and work tables now stood under skylights. The carriage house, repurposed into co-working units and a kitchenette, smelled of fresh paint and coffee. Strings of lights arced over newly planted beds where seedlings had been coaxed through the late thaw. The ribbon stretched across the entrance was simple, not celebratory in a vainglorious way, but marking the threshold from private to public. Clare stepped up to the small podium with the composure she had cultivated. No theatrics, no triumphalism. The crowd was not large. Community partners, trustees, a handful of neighbors, municipal officials, some journalists. In the front row sat Maria and Samira, both early partners in the programming, their faces lit with something steadier than expectation, intent. She spoke briefly. Each sentence weighted to the work ahead. "This place," she said, "is not a monument to a private life. It is a tool for the public good. We will measure our success by the people who learn here, the businesses that open their doors, and the transparency with which we report our progress." She did not pretend to resolve what had happened to her.
She acknowledged the pain in a single sentence. Heartbreak is not a private anomaly. It reveals the systems we build around us. And then moved quickly to the practical. Apprenticeship cohorts, the scholarship fund, the governance structure that would post audited reports annually. The ribbon was cut with understated hands. Choir voices, local, unamplified, sang a hymn that felt like an offering without dramatics. People toured the woodworking bay and a small commercial kitchen, pausing at prototypes made by the first pre-apprentices. There were hugs exchanged with old friends and nods of respect from municipal officers who had watched the project survive legal scrutiny. Julian attended but did not speak at length. He moved through the room as though respecting the boundaries he had accepted in writing. There was no spectacle, only an uneasy recalibration of private life intersecting with civic structures. Over the next year, the Trust's annual dashboard began to accumulate the small, particular numbers Clare had insisted upon. The first cohort comprised 20 apprentices, 8 in culinary arts, 6 in textile and tailoring, and 6 in basic digital repair and carpentry. 5 micro-enterprises launched from the program's incubator units in the carriage house, 2 food trucks that contracted local coffee roasters, a tailoring atelier with a local client base, and a small repair collective. The endowment covered operating expenses for the first 18 months, and the Trust secured 2 municipal maintenance grants after presenting the audit timeline and governance charter. The first independent audit, conducted by a firm appointed by the Oversight Committee, confirmed that seed funding and initial grants had been used per the agreed budget. It found no improprieties in the transfer and verified that a portion of previously flagged transfers had been redirected into sanctioned programming. The auditors recommended a set of process improvements: improved vendor vetting, a standardized contracting template for apprenticeships, and clearer documentation on in-kind donations. These were operational fixes, not moral vindications, and Clare welcomed them. She wanted the Trust to be as mundane and rigorous as a ledger. Public reaction softened into attention rather than hunger. Opinion pieces shifted from gossip to policy. Urbanists wrote about adaptive reuse of private estates for public benefit. Governance scholars discussed the settlements model as a case study in turning private wealth into accountable civic capital. Some caregivers and advocates criticized the spectacle of using a private asset to solve a private problem. Clare accepted those critiques. She understood that conversion of private assets into public goods was not a universal panacea, and that broader systemic reforms were necessary. The Trust, in her view, was a localized remedy, ambitious in its scope but partial in its reach. Clare did not return to the same rhythm she had known. She declined some invitations and accepted others with the clear boundary that her work would be the standard bearer: measurable outcomes, transparent reporting, and an insistence on community voice. She launched a modest speaking series hosted at the incubator, panels on governance and philanthropic projects, workshops on nonprofit measurement, and seminars on corporate fiduciary duty, designed to share lessons without turning pain into spectacle. The series drew practitioners, students, and practitioners who wanted to learn how to anchor civic projects in rigorous process. There were setbacks. An early cohort struggled with a business model that relied too heavily on tourism, which dipped in an off-season. A micro-enterprise closed after 6 months due to cash flow mismatches. A vendor defaulted on a contract. Each setback was processed through the Trust's governance channels: an emergency meeting, a pivot in programming, outreach to new partners. Those small failures taught the team more than the early wins. They reinforced Clare's belief that resilience was procedural as well as personal, a system that absorbed shocks and adjusted. The legal opposition never evaporated entirely. Julian's counsel filed discrete motions challenging aspects of the settlement's implementation, arguing for a narrower interpretation of some transfer mechanics. Most of these were procedural delay tactics and were resolved through arbitration or settled with minor concessions that did not threaten the Trust's core protections. Evan remained vigilant, reminding Clare that the work ahead would be long and that the instruments they had put in place were their best defense against future recapture attempts. Mara's presence diminished in public conversation as the incubator's programming took root. She moved to a quieter life, occasionally seen at community fundraisers that had nothing to do with the trust. Clare never sought to erase Mara from the story. She simply refused to make the woman the axis of her narrative. The trust's governance intentionally kept personalities at arm's length. The institution was a durable object unto itself. A year on, the trust released its first audited report. The headlines were quieter. Metrics replaced melodrama. The report showed that 20 apprentices had completed the initial 9-month program, that 3 micro-enterprises reached sustainable revenue thresholds, and that scholarships totaling a specified amount had been awarded to students from neighboring boroughs. The audit confirmed adherence to the original budget and noted a small variance attributable to an unforeseen repair cost that the trust covered through a contingency reserve. Importantly, the trust published its performance dashboard online, open access to anyone interested in the numbers, the contracts, and the annual plan. Those numbers did not erase the ache. They reframed it. Clare watched Maria graduate her first cohort. Young cooks whose plates testified to exacting work, and felt something in her chest unclench. She kept a ledger of small personal victories, private additions to a life that had reconstituted itself. A consistent schedule of sleep, a relationship with friends that was less performative and more reliable, and a cautious re-entry into a professional life that now included public stewardship. Clare also began to lean into mentorship, hosting monthly sessions where apprentices could consult with business advisors, managers could troubleshoot operations, and community members could propose programming ideas. She started a modest scholarship, named not for herself, but for a neighborhood elder who had taught sewing to generations. The scholarship's title had been her idea, a small gesture acknowledging that sustainable work is built by those who pass on knowledge. Over time, the incubator's reach rippled outward. Local suppliers were contracted for materials, bringing modest revenue to nearby suppliers. A city apprenticeship program partnered with the trust to create formal certifications for the carpentry track. Data from the trust's dashboard entered municipal planning discussions as an example of repurposing underutilized assets to address workforce gaps. The project's existence shifted some conversations about corporate responsibility from performative giving to accountable, measurable interventions. Clare did not experience a tidy closure. The chest wound, the public exposure, the betrayal, left a scar she expected to carry. But the scar did not define her. It marked the place from which she had begun to construct an architecture of responsibility. Her identity, once entwined invisibly with the merit name and its assumptions, rebalanced around a body of work that could be audited, reproduced, and critiqued. She took solace in that scrutiny, transparency as a discipline, not a performance. 2 winters after the overheard sentence, the trust held a small celebration for its second cohort's graduation. The ceremony was modest. Soup made by graduate chefs, a pop-up stall of hand-sewn garments, and a group of technicians displaying refurbished devices that had been sold at a neighborhood electronics co-op. Journalists attended but were relegated to a sideline. The day belonged to apprentices, families, and municipal partners. Clare moved through the crowd with none of the guardedness that had accompanied her the first months. She answered questions about processes and pushed attention back to the people whose lives the trust aimed to change. In private moments, she reflected on the arc. The Christmas evening when she had overheard those 3 words had been an incision, an event that forced the light into a place it had previously avoided. From that night had grown months of procedural labor, a settlement that redistributed assets into a public trust, and a project that produced measurable outcomes. None of it was a miracle. All of it was work. Legal drafting, community outreach, neglected wiring repaired, vendor contracts reconciled, audits performed. Her final consolidation was not loud. She did not publish an op-ed denouncing the past, nor did she launch a personal brand around reinvention. Instead, she convened a small fellowship at the incubator, a rotating group of women leaders committed to governance, transparent philanthropy, and mentorship. The fellowship met monthly, and Clare's role as convener was modest. She set the agenda, invited experts, and insisted on a culture of accountability. On an evening when early snow began again to gloss the city, Clare walked the garden path illuminated by low lanterns.
The summer house windows glowed with light from a late workshop. Inside, a group of students bent over sewing machines, while another cluster tuned a donated generator for the rooftop solar panels. An image of collective hands keeping the place alive. She paused at the threshold, feeling the hush that comes before a room fills. The air smelled faintly of oil and fabric and a coffee someone had left on the counter. She thought of Heartbreak, Unveiled on a Christmas night. How public exposure had forced transaction into transparency. How personal failure had been converted into an institutional hedge against similar wrongs. Those conversions were not perfect. The instruments crafted would be tested and might be litigated. But the work had produced tangible results. Apprentices placed, auditors' reports published, scholarships awarded, and a governance blueprint that others could study. She touched the doorframe, worn smooth where many hands had passed, and allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement. Grief had been real, but it had not become the only story. The summer house hummed with a different narrative now, of training, of meals shared after shifts, of a small business opening its shutters to a neighborhood that had been waiting. At the gate she paused, phone in hand, and typed a short note to Mark. Annual report ready for posting. Let's schedule the review with the advisory panel next week. She added a line for herself on her mental list. Visit the new cohort's first pitch night. Then she turned and walked home through soft snow, each step a quiet metronome. A short time later, in a concise closing post on the Trust's website, the board summarized the first 2-year outcomes. Cohorts trained, micro-enterprises launched, scholarships dispersed, and published audit confirmations demonstrating proper fund use. The post closed with a promise not of certainty, but of commitment to continuous transparency, community partnership, and living metrics. Clare read the post alone in her kitchen, the room a familiar geometry of light and shadow. She did not close the book on what had been lost. She had not expected to. Instead, she closed a chapter that had demanded a different kind of labor, strategic, public, accountable.
The summer house, once private, had become a node in a wider civic ecology. The Trust had not erased pain. It had made it part of a process that amplified public good. If viewers have questions or thoughts about how they would respond in a similar situation, practical steps, personal boundaries, or governance ideas, share one sentence starting "I would" in the comments. Real people learn from each other's instincts and experiences. If you want to follow how this project evolves and see other stories of conversion from private rupture to public accountability, subscribe for updates and resources on governance, audits, and community-driven redevelopment. Clare closed the laptop and stood by the window one last time. Beyond the glass, the garden-lighted path led to a door that remained open most days to anyone with a willingness to learn. The image lodged in her, lantern-lit, muddy boots by the threshold, hands busy in work that mattered, was not a tidy ending.